Hello, Bob's back with Clarice. Clarice! Hello, Clarice! Lispector. Near to the Wild Heart. Chapter 17. The Viper. It's as if I were gently penetrating something. Ottavio read while the clock ticked away the seconds and broke the night silence with 11 strokes. It's as if I were gently penetrating something. There's the impression. This lightness comes from who knows where. Curtains droop languidly over their own chords, but there is also the black march, at a standstill, two eyes staring, unable to say anything. God perched on a tree and twittering, and straight lines running, unfinished, horizontal and cold. That's the impression. Mature moments go on dripping, and no sooner does one fall than another surfaces softly, its face pallid and minute. Suddenly, the moments, too, come to an end. The without time runs down my walls, tortuous and blind. Little by little, it accumulates in a dark and tranquil lake, and I call out, I have lived. Night silenced the things outside. Some toad or other croaked intermittently. Each shrub was an unmoving, recoiling face. In the distance, there glimmered and flickered tiny red dish lights, sleepless eyes in the darkness like that of water. The tall, slender sunflowers lit up the garden by stages. What was one to think at that moment? She was so pure and free that she could choose and didn't know. She could see something, but she couldn't express it, not even mentally, for the image had become tenuous in the darkness of her body. She simply sensed it and looked expectantly through the window as if she were seeing her own face in the night. Would this be the most she could hope to achieve? To approach herself, to almost touch, only to feel the ebbing wave behind her firmly and gently sucking her in, engulfing her, then leaving her, with the startling and intangible memory of a hallucination. Even at that moment, perceiving the night and her own vague thoughts, she was still detached from them, forever that small, impenetrable mass looking on. That tiny light gleaming in silence, remote, solitary, unconquered. She never surrendered. She looked around her, the room slowly panting, poorly lit as in a spell of vertigo. She raised her head a little, examined the space, and became aware of the rest of the house, which was lost in darkness. The objects, grave and indistinct, floating around the corners. She would have to grope her way the moment she went through the door, especially if she were a child in her aunt's house, waking up at night, her mouth dry, going to look for some water, knowing that people were isolated, every one of them locked inside this secret, impenetrable sleep. Especially if she were that child, and as on that night, or those nights, upon crossing the pantry, she should discover the moonlight settled in the yard, as in a cemetery, that wind free and uncertain, especially if she were that frightened child, she would bump into objects she couldn't make out in the dark, which, when touched, would suddenly contract into chairs and tables, into barriers, with open, unfeeling, relentless eyes. So they too were imprisoned. After that knock, the pain, the moonlight stripping the terrace of cement, thirst rising up through her body like some memory, deep silence in the house, the neighboring rooftops motionless and livid. Once more, Joanna tried to go back into the room, into the presence of Ottavio. She was rid of things, of her own things, created by her and alive. Were they to abandon her in the desert amidst the solitary glaciers? In any spot on earth she would preserve the same white, limp hands, the same almost serene aloofness. She would take a bundle of clothes and slowly go away, not to escape, but to go away. Just like that, so comforting. Not to escape, but to go away, or to shout aloud, straight and infinite, with her eyes closed and tranquil, to walk until she encountered those tiny red lights, flickering as if going out or coming on. Was she also about to die or be born? No, not to go, to remain trapped by the moment, just as a pensive look clings to the void, quiet, suspended in midair. The vibration of a distant tram pervaded her, as if she were a tunnel, a night train passing through a tunnel. Goodbye. No, anyone traveling at night simply looks through the window and doesn't wave goodbye. No one knows where the hovels are. The unwashed bodies are murky and require no light. Ottavio, she said, for she was lost. Joanna's voice, expressionless, light and direct, blotted out the room. He raised his eyes. What is it? He inquired. And his voice was full of flesh and blood. It assembled the room inside the room. It labeled and defined things, a gust of air reviving the flames. The crowd had invaded the empty square. She struggled for a moment, shuddered, woke up. Everything was shining under the lamp, tranquil and happy as round the hearth. Within the shadows of her body, the futility of waiting pervaded her somnambulism like a bird winging through the night. Ottavio, she repeated. He was waiting. Then, once more conscious of the room, of the man, and of herself, her own flames gathered strength. She knew that she should proceed logically, that the man expected her to go on. She looked for a signal, a plea, some definite word. I have the impression that you only came to give me a child, she said, and only now have I had the opportunity to fulfill the promise I made to Lydia. Even to go on wanting the child would mean tying herself to the future. Ottavio stared at her for a second in amazement, drained of any affection. But, he murmured after some time, his voice faltering, timid and hoarse, but can't you see that everything is almost finished between us? And has been almost from the start, he ventured. It will only finish when I've had a child, she replied, vague and obstinate. Ottavio opened his eyes in her direction, his face pale and suddenly wary beneath the table lamp, where his book lay open. Isn't that a little far-fetched? He asked, ironically. She ignored the remark. What existed between us is not enough. I still haven't given you everything. You may come looking for me one day, or I might miss you, although after the child is born, there will be nothing left for us except to separate. And what about the child? He inquired. Where does the child come into this clever arrangement? Oh, he'll survive, she replied. Is that all you have to say? He rejoined with sarcasm. What else can one do? She launched the question into the air, casually, without expecting any answer. Ottavio, thinking she was waiting, despite his nervousness and rage at having to obey her, concluded uncertainly. Be happy, for example. Joanna raised her eyes and watched him from afar with surprise and a certain happiness. Why? Ottavio asked himself in alarm. He became flustered, as if he had cracked some silly joke. She saw that he was angry, curled up in his chair, hurt, and dejected as if someone had spat in his face. Without stirring, she leaned towards him, full of pity and more than pity. She pursed her lips, embarrassed, a love full of tears. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying not to see him, not to love him any more. At heart, she knew she could unite herself with Ottavio. He scarcely knew just how much. Perhaps it was enough to tell him about her own fears, for example, summarizing in words those feelings of shame and uneasiness when she summoned the waiter in a loud voice, and everyone heard her except the waiter, who wasn't listening. She laughed. Ottavio would like to know about this. She could also unite herself with him by summing up for him her urge to escape whenever she found herself among smiling men and women, and she found it difficult to relate to them or experience her own body. Or perhaps she was mistaken, and these confidences did not bring them closer together, just as when she was a little girl and she used to imagine that, if she could tell someone about the mystery of the dictionary, she would link herself forever to that someone. Like this. After the L, it was useless looking for the I. Even for the L, the letters were companions, scattered like beans over the kitchen table. But after the L, they scattered solemn and compact, and you could never find, for example, an easy letter like A among them. She smiled, opened her eyes little by little, and now relaxed, subdued. She could confront him with disdain. You know perfectly well that's not the point. Oh, Ottavio, she murmured. After an instant, the flame suddenly revived. What's happening to us when all is said and done? what's happening to us. Ottavio's voice was gruff and sharp when he replied, "You always left me on my own." "No," she said nervously. "It's just that everything I have cannot be given, nor taken. I myself am capable of dying of thirst. In my own presence, solitude is mingled with my essence." "No," he repeated stubbornly, his eyes wild. "You always left me on my own because that's what you wanted. Because that's what you wanted." "I'm not to blame," Joanna cried out. "Believe me. It's engraved in me that solitude comes because each body inevitably has its own end. It's engraved in me that love ceases with death. My presence has always been branded like this." "When I got to know you," he said sardonically, "I thought you were going to teach me something more than this. I needed," he went on in a lower tone, "what I perceived in you, yet you always denied me." "No, no," she protested in a weak voice. "Believe me, Ottavio, the things I really knew penetrated my skin, came upon me almost by stealth. Everything I know I never learned, nor could I ever teach it to others." They fell silent for a second. In a fleeting moment, Joanna saw herself seated beside her father, a ribbon in her hair, in a waiting room. Her father, with his hair unkempt, rather grubby, perspiring, his mood jovial. She could feel the ribbon more than anything else. She had been playing in her bare feet and had pulled on her shoes in haste, without washing them, and now they were creaking noisily inside the leather. How could her father be so cheerful? How could he fail to see that the two of them were the most miserable of people, and that no one was as much as looking at them? But she wished to prove to everyone that she could go on as she was, that he was her father, and that she would protect him, that she would never wash her feet. She saw herself seated beside her father, and she didn't know what had occurred immediately before dinner and immediately afterwards. Nothing but a shadow, and she took refuge in it, listening to the music of confusion murmuring in her depths, intangible, blind. "Nevertheless," Ottavio went on, "you yourself said there is a certain moment in the joy of being able to do something which exceeds the fear itself of death. Two persons who live together," he continued in a whisper, "try, perhaps, to attain that moment. You didn't want to." She said nothing. When she didn't reply, he became uneasy. He went back to the days of his childhood, people angry with him, obliging him to promise, to please them, full of apologies. He recalled some offense or other he had once committed regarding Joanna and tried to rid himself of it immediately, so that it might never more weigh on his conscience. And even though aware that he was about to say something irrelevant, he could not restrain himself. "You're right, Joanna. Everything that comes to us is brute matter, but there is nothing in existence that escapes transfiguration," he began, and his expression immediately became one of utter embarrassment when confronted by Joanna's eyebrows. He forced himself to continue. "Don't you remember telling me one day, 'Today's sorrow will be tomorrow's happiness'? There is nothing in existence that escapes transfiguration. Don't you remember? Perhaps it wasn't exactly with those words." "I remember." "Well, at that moment I couldn't really grasp what you were trying to say. I even got annoyed, I suppose." "I know," Joanna said. "You told me that if you had a stomach upset, I should come to lay the same absurd extravagance at your feet." Yes, you're quite right," Ottavio said impatiently. "I seem to remember that you weren't even intimidated, but listen, I don't think I ever told you. I realized afterwards that there was no exaggeration in what you'd said. I don't think I ever confessed this to you, or am I wrong? Look, I'm even inclined to believe that there might be some truth in those words. There is nothing in existence that escapes transfiguration." He blushed. "Perhaps that's the secret. Perhaps that's what I perceived in you. There are certain presences which allow transfiguration." Since she remained silent, he insisted further. "You promise too much. All the possibilities you offer people within themselves. With a look, I'm at a loss to explain it." And just as she hadn't shown herself to be proud or diminished when he had first spoken ironically about her absurd extravagance, she didn't now gloat over Ottavio's humility. He looked at her. Once again, he had not known how to attach himself to that woman. Once more she defeated him. There was silence in the room, and the light and emptiness settled on the white keys of the open piano. Something had died. slowly and truly died, it would be useless to reunite the happiness of living with that moment. What comes next? Ottavio murmured. And this time he had succumbed to the essence of things. He had been drawn to Joanna's truth. I don't know, she said. Ottavio studied her. What was on her mind? She seemed so remote. She appeared to be hovering in the center of something mobile, her body floating, unsupported, almost non-existent. Just as when she started to relate things from the past, and he could see that she was lying. Then Joanna's head would slowly wander. She would gently incline her forehead, raise it again, begin to stammer. There was a calculated and solid nucleus to begin with, but then everything became fluent and innocuous. And Ottavio would look at her, oblivious of himself. He would end up in a state of anguish, for if he wanted to touch her, he couldn't. There was an intangible circle around that creature, which was impenetrable and kept her apart. Bitterness then possessed him because he could not perceive her as a woman, and his quality as a man became futile, and he was incapable of being anything other than a man. In Cousin Isabel's garden, white roses grew all those years ago. He had often admired them, perplexed, not knowing how to possess them, because in the presence of those roses, his only power, that of a human being, was useless. He put them to his face, to his lips. He inhaled their perfume. They went on quivering, delicate and luxuriant. If only they had thick petals, he used to think. If only they were hard. If only their petals would give a dry sound when they dropped and hit the ground. Feeling the heightening beauty of those flowers penetrate him like that of Joanna when she lied, he was seized by an impotent fury. He would crush them, chew them, destroy them. Looking at her now, without quite knowing how to define that face, he wanted to revive that old feeling, to find himself once more in Cousin Isabel's garden. But in the absence of any other thought, he suddenly realized that Joanna would go away. Yes, he would carry on. He had Lydia, the child, himself. She would go away, he knew, but what did it matter? He didn't need Joanna. No, he didn't need her, yet he couldn't do without her, and suddenly he just couldn't fathom how he had managed to live with her for so long. It struck him that after her departure he would simply have to untie the present to the distant past, Cousin Isabel's house. Lydia, his bride-to-be, his plans to write a substantial book, his personal traumas, tepid, sweet, and loathsome as depravity, to that past barely interrupted by Joanna. It would be nice to be rid of her, to draw up plans for his book on civil law. He could already picture himself moving among his things with intimacy, but he also saw himself with strange and sudden clarity, one evening perhaps, feeling a twinge of pain in his chest, screwing up his eyes, aware that his hands were empty without even looking at them, the indefinable feeling of loss when Joanna might leave him. She would surge inside him, not in his head like any familiar reminiscence, but in the center of his body, vague and lucid, interrupting his existence like the sudden clanging of a bell. He would suffer as if she were telling the most outrageous lies, yet as if he were unable to expel that hallucination, and were progressively inhaling it like air inside his body, which might, thankfully, turn into water. He would feel the clean, open space inside his heart where none of Joanna's seeds would bring afforestation, for she was an inviolate as future thought. Nevertheless, she was his, yes, deeply, diffusely, like some music one has heard. You're mine, mine, don't leave me, he implored her from the depths of his being. But he would not utter such words, for he wanted her to go. He wouldn't know what to do with Joanna if she were to stay. He would go back to Lydia, pregnant and swollen. He gradually realized that he had chosen to renounce all that was most precious in his being, that tiny suffering portion which he succeeded in living beside Joanna. And after a moment of suffering, as if he were abandoning himself, his eyes shining with fatigue, he sensed the futility of desiring something more for the future. Perplexed, he was finally witnessing his own strange, intense purification, as if he were slowly penetrating an inorganic world. Do you really want a child? He asked her, terrified of the solitude in which he had ventured. He suddenly wanted to link himself to life, to lean on Joanna until he could lean on Lydia. Just as someone crossing an abyss clings to tiny boulders before clambering up the rock itself. "We should know how to make it live," came Joanna's voice. "Yes, you're right," he said uneasily, and he passionately longed to be with Lydia, to go back to her forever. He realized that this would be his last night with Joanna, the last, the last. "No, perhaps I'm right," Joanna continued. "Perhaps one shouldn't think about any of this before having a child. One lights a bright lamp, everything becomes clear and safe. One drinks tea each afternoon, embroiders, but above all, a lamp brighter than this one. And the child lives. That's quite true. So true that you had no fears for the life of Lydia's child." Ottavio did not flinch. He didn't as much as blink. But his whole being shrank, and his pallor shone like a lit candle. Joanna went on speaking at her leisure, but he didn't hear her because, little by little, almost without thinking, fury surfaced in his heavy heart, dulled his hearing, clouded his vision. What? Fury, stumbling and panting, raged inside him. So she knew about Lydia, about the child. She knew and kept silent. She deceived me. That stifling burden weighed even more deeply inside him. She quietly condoned my infamy. She continued to sleep with me, to tolerate me. For how long? Why? But why, dear God? Bitch. Joanna jumped, lifted her head rapidly. "You're despicable." His voice could scarcely control itself in that swollen throat. The veins on his neck and forehead stood out, thick and knotted in triumph. "It was your aunt who once called you a viper. Yes, a viper. Viper, viper, viper." He was now shouting wildly, unable to control himself. Each cry could barely release itself from that convulsed source, vibrated almost gleefully in midair. She watched him beat his fist on the table, maddened, weeping with fury. For how long? Because Joanna was aware, as if listening to music in the distance, that everything continued to exist, and that those cries were not separate arrows, but were merging with what existed. Until suddenly spent and empty, he slumped into a chair, his face numb, his eyes dead. He sat staring at the floor. Both of them sank into solitary and peaceful silence. Perhaps years passed. Everything was as bright as an eternal star, and they hovered so quietly that they could feel future time clearly revolving inside their bodies with the denseness of the long past, which instant by instant they had just lived, until the first light of dawn began to disperse the night. In the garden, the darkness frayed like a veil, and the sunflowers trembled in the nascent breeze. Dim lights, however, still flickered in the far distance, as if coming from the sea. And that's the end of that chapter. The man's departure awaits. Goodbye, Ralph.